Hey everybody, Japheth here. Today we're going to step through setting up FutureMUD on a new server. So the fact that you found this page, you probably understand what I'm talking about when I say FutureMUD. In this particular example, I'm going to walk you through installing it on a Linux server. The reason for that is that Linux is typically cheaper. You get more bang for your buck in terms of what you pay for the server. It is more difficult. There's a few, the way in which Linux is free is that your time has no value. And I personally run LabMud on a Windows server, but I figure for most of you, cost is an important consideration. So we're going to step through the Linux steps. So this web page is one you'll need to go to, the LabMud web page, FutureMUD public releases. That's where you can always come to get the latest version of any of the files. I recommend before you start that you always check that you have the latest version. In this particular case, we're going to be starting with the database seeder and the Linux executable. Just a note, you must be running a 64-bit system to run any of this. Now, I've gone and set myself up a blank Ubuntu Linux box with Amazon Web Services. It's got nothing on it. This is just their pre-packaged one that has nothing. I'm running it on a T3 micro instance, which will set you back a little under $10 a month. It's perfectly adequate for the development phase of a MUD. Even a small MUD with only, I don't know, maybe 5 players, you wouldn't have any problem at all running it on this size server. You might want to up it if you were going above 10 or 20 players, particularly once you start getting to the 30 or 50, or you have a very large world or very complex system set up. So, but it's adequate for now. You can choose whichever hosting service you want. I like AWS because they're quite easy, but I think they might come at a little bit of a premium, so shop around. Now, there are a few steps we're going to go through. The 3 core steps that we need to do to get everything running is to set up MySQL, to set up .NET 5, and then to run the database seeder. And that's pretty much the core steps before you can run the MUD. So the first things first, we will do the setting up of MySQL. So FutureMUD requires MySQL 5.7 or 8. If you run the default install commands on most distros, they will get you version 8. You will have to go out of your way probably to get a non-compatible version. 5.6 is an example of one that's still quite common that is not compatible. Just use 5.7 or 8. So I'm running as a root user here on Ubuntu. This is the command that you run. It's obviously different on each of the different distros, so you'll have to navigate that. Yes, we do want to install MySQL. This will take a few moments. Now, once it has finished installing, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up a user. While you could just run everything as root, I heavily recommend that you don't do that. The MUD does require the ability to manipulate its own database because it keeps the database structure up to date. So it needs more than just, read to and write from privileges. That being said, it's good practice to restrict your applications to being able to only access the data they should be able to access. In this case, we will step through that. So after you've installed MySQL, you want to run the MySQL secure installation just to finish the startup steps. I'm not going to enforce password complexity in this demo, and my password is just going to be FutureMUD. We don't want anonymous users, we don't want to allow remote root logins, and we don't want the test database. And we do want to reload the privileges. So the next, that's the MySQL server set up and running. So that's now running on this server. What we need to do next is set up the user. So I'm going to create a user I've opened up, by the way, the MySQL program, so we're now entering commands into MySQL. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a user. So I'm calling this user MUD. It's only restricted to being run on the local host, so it can't be done remotely. You might need to change that around. For example, if you're running your database and your server on a different computer, some sort of distributed setup, but that's more of an advanced application, and you'll obviously want to update your password to whatever you're going to use. I'm going to use password in this case. You also want to grant privileges. So the MUD needs basically all of the privileges except grant, but I'm just going to be lazy and give it everything on everything for this demo. But you might want to later restrict this part here to just the databases you actually want it to do. And then once we've done that, we have to flush the privileges to apply the changes we just made. All right, now we can exit MySQL. So that's MySQL set up. That's all the setup that you need to do with MySQL. The next thing that we need to do is install .NET 5. So FutureMUD is a C# application. It runs on the .NET 5 framework. The .NET 5 since version 3.1 has been able to run on Windows, Linux, or Mac, so it's quite cross-platform. I confess I haven't tested many of the FutureMUD elements on Mac because I don't have access to one, but I do test them on both Windows and Linux. And yeah, I'm guessing not many of you are going to be hosting on a Mac server anyway, if such a thing even exists. So in order to set up .NET 5, there are actually some guides on the website. You'll see I have links to them for Windows and Linux. We'll click on the Linux one, and you just select the distro that you're using, and it gives you some commands to run. I'm running on 20.04 at the moment. It's obviously supports .NET 5. So first you need to wget a particular package. Wget is Linux's way of downloading things from the internet. Then you need to run a run dpkg, which I believe is basically just like unzipping a package. Then you need to run the installation. You actually don't need the SDK, you need the runtime. You don't need the ASP.NET Core runtime, you just need the basic.NET runtime. So I've already gone through and updated the command there, so you just replace ASP.NET Core runtime with .NET runtime. You can install ASP.NET Core runtime if you want to, it's just not necessary. There we go. So .NET 5 has been installed. The next thing that you need to do is to download the executable, which is going to be, in this case, we're starting with the database seeder. We want the Linux one there. So once again, you're going to need to use wget. So wget, that's the link if you right click on that file. It's right there. So we'll wget to download that. Now it is a zip file, so some distros won't come with an unzip program installed, and I only know how to use one. So I'm just going to apt-get install the unzip program quickly, and then I am going to unzip the zip file, and that will just unpack it all into the folder. So as you can see, it unpacked a bunch of files. There's a README file, runs you through the steps here, and this is the actual executable here, database seeder. Now, an important step is to change the permissions before you execute it. I don't actually know what the right permissions, someone who's more of a Linux guru should know, but you probably want at least 7 that allows you to read, write, and execute the if you're the owner, which we are. So I'll just change everything in that folder. There we go. Now, having unzipped it, all that remains is to actually run it. So in Linux, you do like so, /database seeder, and here we go. So now we're in the database seeder. As it says, this tool sets up a database and imports some minimum pre-generated data that the MUD needs to run. So FutureMUD is quite customizable. The downside to customizability is that it's very data driven. I've gone through and set up some reasonable basics to get everybody going. As you get more advanced, you may want to play around with it. You may want to roll some of your own data and not use the seeder, or you may want to do all sorts of stuff. And another thing to keep in mind, you can always all of the database is self-contained. Everything about your MUD is in that database. So if you wanted to install FutureMUD on your local PC and mess around or try different options in the seeder, once you're happy with it, you can simply import that database onto your server, no problems. So you can see how things work. So I recommend you probably don't do that on your server itself. You probably do that. But anyway, the seeder is a tool that does it all. So the first thing it needs to know is how to connect to your database. So with the setup that it gives you a suggestion up the top of what it thinks your string is going to look like. Now we're going to call our database demo DBO. Our UID we called MUD. Our password was password. And the default command timeout 5 minutes. Some of the migrations go over the default 30-second length. It's better if you just give it a longer command timeout, makes it run smoother. That should be all good. Hit enter, and it will now go through and build the database. So it uses a migration. Basically, as you can see there are 34 migrations from when I've made it. It'll go through and apply them one by one. This process usually takes a couple of minutes. It depends very heavily on how good your server is. So for example, on my development box, it's really, a few seconds. But even as you can see here, the first one takes the longest because that's setting up 90% of the database right there. And then it's going through in order and applying all the changes. It's a pretty handy little system, actually. And in this way, you won't need to manually apply SQL scripts or anything like that to manage your database as I update them. So there we go. So the database is actually created now. So the next step, it actually shows you a bunch of seeders. So these are how the default information that the MUD needs to run get put in. You really need to run everything up to seeder number 7, the human seeder, if you want to get into the game. You could consider everything after 7 to be optional, but I highly recommend you run all of the seeders until you really know what you're doing. The core one is absolutely mandatory for every MUD. So as it says here, it sets up a lot of core data that everything needs. So it sets up some universal progs that all the other seeders use, some fixed item prototypes that it expects to be there, a whole bunch of placeholder stuff. So we'll just run it. Now, with each of the seeders, it's going to ask you some questions. So what's the name of the MUD we're setting up? You probably have thought of this, but you can change this later. demo mud. I'm going to call my implementer account Japheth. I'm going to call the password, and I'm going to give my labmud email as the email address. Now it will go through and apply all of this data. This one can take some time. There we go. Now, as you do the green packages, other ones will highlight green to say that they think they're ready to be installed. You generally shouldn't run something that's red. It's reporting something that it thinks is incompatible if you run it. So the time seeder sets up clocks and calendars and all that sort of stuff. This is a big wall of text here, but it's basically saying how many in-game seconds per second. I highly recommend you use either 2 or 5, but you can choose. 5 is probably more classic for most MUDs. I've got a bunch of default calendars in here. If you happen to be running a game that uses exactly one of these calendars, fantastic, your job's done. If you don't and you need to make a custom one for your world, I recommend that you use the Latin ancient character because it shows off the most features that you might want to use for your own calendar. So we're going to do that in this case. And you need to set up a starting year for your calendar. So I'm going to put 550, which I think was about 75 BC in the Roman calendar. All right, attributes. This sets up your attributes. So I've got a few default packages. I am going to go in this case with the labmud options. This is how things are shown. In most RPI MUDs, you have a word to describe things rather than showing the raw value. RPI and labmud should be very familiar to most people who've played on any RPIs. I don't really recommend modern or raw, but if you must go with those, go ahead. I'm going to use labmud once again. Done. Skills. All right, so this will set up some example skills and some stuff that's required for building skills as well. So skill branching on use, you can either enable it or disable it. So if you enable it, using a skill and rolling a skill that you don't have has a chance to branch it. If you want to control the branching in a different way, like if skills are restricted by class or you want to use some other system, you would turn this off. A classic RPI engine would be yes for it to be turned on. And you can choose from a couple of skill cap models. So you've got the RPI. This is how it determines what the maximum value for a skill is. So in RPI, you generally have skills that have caps that are some multiplier of attributes. You can have class-based ones. If you have a class-based system, Armageddon would be a good example where the maximum value you can get in a skill is determined by your class. You'd want to use the class option. And flat is that the cap is the same for everybody, so it might be, everyone can get to 100 in a skill or something like that, or you might want to do something different. Again, I am going to use RPI in this case. And skill gain models. This is how your skills will go up. So you've got the two classic RPI type ones where you can branch skills by use. In the RPI engine, you had to fail a skill for it to improve. The idea was the higher it got, the less fails you got, and therefore the slower your skill gain was. In the labmud setup, you need to succeed to pass, but it also requires increasingly higher difficulties. So you have to be doing harder and harder stuff to get your skill ups. Armageddon, again, it's a use improve on failure, and you only branch based on your classes and other prerequisite skills unlocking stuff. And success tree is basically a mixture of the labmud and Armageddon style. I'm going to go with labmud. Now, if you want to set up some example skills here, you can just put their names and it will set them in. A few ones that I know you will use: swimming, climbing, flying is a skill for flying things, falling, running. Don't do any combat skills and don't do any language skills because they get set up later. You could put in craft skills or whatever you wanted in here as well, but we'll just do those ones. And we want to tie these ones to the intelligent. Actually, they're all. Let's make it agility, dexterity. There we go. Now, it says that you can use an example, give an example language here. If you're intending to use a culture pack, and I currently have 2 of those implemented, you probably don't want to put one in here. If you're going to do your own thing and not use a culture pack, then definitely do one here. So we're going to do a culture pack in this case, so I'm going to leave it blank. But worst case scenario, maybe type in something like admin, so you have a secret admin language. In fact, that's what I might do in this case, just to, you know, and we'll make language tied to intelligence. So there we go. Skills, currencies, sets up money. I have a few example ones done. If you want to take one of these and modify it, that's great. Choose something that sounds the most like the system that you want to have. Again, the fantasy and the Roman system show up some of the most complex things you can do with it. The bits is obviously the most simple, dollars and pounds somewhere in between. We're going to go with Roman in our case. Clans. This just sets up a whole bunch of templates for clans, basically. So when you create a clan, you can use a template for the clan rather than having to generate the whole thing every time. So I've got some common ones, some that I took from LabMud and some that I took from other places. You can choose to use them or not. So yes, we'll set up a template for gangs. No, we won't set up a NATO encoded army. We seem to be going with a Roman theme, so we'll go for a Roman society, a Roman legion. Council or committee is always a good one. All right, the human seeder. This is, as I said, the last probably mandatory one that you need to run. This sets up a human race and an admin avatar. The first decision you've got is whether you're using the full health model. So if you've never played LabMud or seen FutureMUD before, the full health model uses circulation, organs, all sorts of systems. I recommend you play around with it, but not everybody might want to. There's 2 other models. There's a simple hit point one that you'll be familiar with from most other MUDs. Both Armageddon and the RPI engine are basically the equivalent of that. HP Plus uses HP, but also supports if the brain or the heart is destroyed, the person dies, so it just makes it sort of a transition between the 2. I'm going to go with full. Obviously proud of my system. You can choose the next decision is either whether you want to use hands like the RPI engine or inventory like say Armageddon. So hands, you have specific hand body parts and you can only hold one thing in a hand. Inventory, you just have this nebulous inventory that you hold stuff in. It's not tied to any body parts. Once again, I like hands, so I'm going hands. If you don't want body parts severing in the game, choose no here. I'm going to choose yes. If you include bones, so that this next question is about bones, it'll add all the bones for the human model. If you don't choose to include bones, then there won't be any bone breaking. I'm going to put bones in. It sets up, there's something in FutureMUD called characteristics. They're kind of like variables, so things like eye color, hair color, skin color, etc. There's one in here called distinctive feature. That's completely optional whether you want to include it or not. I'm going to include it because I like it. And you can include a non-binary non-binary gender. So you can, if you answer no here, it just sets up humans with male, female, or you can use male, female, non-binary. Non-binary generally tends to get to select either the male or the female options for most things. So depending on your MUD and how you want to set it up, that's up to you. I'm going to go with yes. And do you want to generate an admin avatar? I highly recommend you do at least make one admin avatar. So technically the MUD is now connectable. Now that we have the human race, we can log into our character. We should run the other seeders as well. But that's the minimum. You at this stage you are now good to go if you really want to. Maybe character creation. Character creation probably ought to be done as well, even if you're not making a character yet. It'll crash if somebody tries to log in if you haven't done it. So I'll step you through combat as well. You're here to see the options and see me talk through them. So I'm guessing you want to install all the attacks, so unarmed attacks, that's like punches and kicks and all that sort of stuff. Armed attacks and weapons, yeah, why not? Pre-modern weapons like bows, crossbows, etc. I don't see many MUDs not choosing yes. Obviously, there's some stuff I haven't quite finished in the seeder. They'll be rolled out in future versions. So it asks you the question here, but as it says there, it's not yet implemented. I haven't actually got the gunpowder weapons, so we'll say no. And we don't want modern firearms because we're going for a Roman theme. So this question's about how random you want the damage to be. In LabMUD, the damage formulas are actually quite static. You hit somebody with the same result, with the same weapon, with the same stats, you're going to do the same damage each time. But there are ways in the combat formula that gets mitigated. People's defense reduces it, all that sort of stuff. But some people prefer a bit more random. You can have it fully random, so as it says there, 20 to 100% of the damage. Partially random and static. I've actually come to like partial as I've been playing around with it. That's where I'd probably peg it, so I'm going to go with partial. We want to use the strength attribute to determine damage, and we want to use the dexterity attribute for balance and coordination. Do we want to make a separate skill called parry? So you can have parry as a separate skill on its own, or you can have it, if you don't do this, all the weapons will parry with their own weapon skill. So if you've got a sword, it'll parry with the sword skill. I'm going to create a separate parry skill, I think. And this is how broad you want to set the weapon types and skills up. So LabMUD used the top option there, weapons, where you had things swords, axes, spears, daggers, polearms, etc. with their own skill. Broad basically just sets it up as 4 categories: edged weapons, bludgeoning, piercing, two-handed. I think that's very similar to how ARM does it from memory. And SOI had this unique combination of light, medium, heavy, edge, bludgeon, pierced. If you're wanting to create that sort of option, you can choose it. I'm going to go with the LabMUD option. Surprise, surprise. Now you can choose how compact the combat messages are. LabMUD does the top version, but I actually think I like the sparse as I've been setting it up. So with all the results on separate lines. So that's the way I'm going to go here. Now it's applying all the data. There's a lot of attacks. There we go. Character creation. You will have to come in later and edit some of the text that the character creation thing generates. It's basically just there to get you something you can use. It'll set up some placeholder text that you need to customize to what's appropriate for your world. Now, if you want to use RPP, Karma, etc., set it up here. You don't have to. I am going to. I'm going to call it Karma. So it's Karma, so one's sort of a short name, one's a full name. Build points. This is basically a time regenerating resource that's separate to things like Karma. You can use it or not. I'm going to choose to use it. Are we going to use classes in this MUD? So I think we're not going to set it up with classes, but you could set it up with classes if you want to. If you do choose yes, it will ask you if you want to set up any subclasses. Now there's two ways you can set up the order of character creation for a start. You can start with the race selection or you can start with the role selection. If you've got a class-based MUD, role first selection is the best way to go. If you don't, you can use either, but the more traditional RPI engine way to do it would be race first. So, in that example, you would pick an orc and then it would, from there on in character creation, the options would be specific to what you had chosen at each previous step. Whereas if you went with role first, you might choose your class and then it would show you the list of options you can choose for race that can play that class or whatever. So it's kind of up to you. As I said, in my particular, another way you could do that in a classless system would be if you had roles as the thing that you wanted people to start with. Like I'm a member of the military or whatever, and then all the other options come off the role that they've selected. But I'm going to go with the traditional race first one. So as it says, select role or race, we'll go race first. For attributes, you can either use an orderer, like both Armageddon and Shadows of Isildur do, which is basically just that you choose the order your stats go in, but it randomly rolls them. Or you can do a point buy system, which is what LabMUD does. I actually like the point system, so I'm going to go with that. And with skills, you can either have a straight classic SOI style picker where you just pick the skills that you want and they start at a particular value, or you can have the boosts version where you pick them, but then you can also pay build points to boost them. I like boosts, so I'm going with that. FutureMUD uses a system of merits and flaws, but you can also brand them as quirks. If you go with merits and flaws, you have a screen where you select merits and a screen where you select flaws, and you can make them have to balance them. So, if you pick a merit, you have to pick a flaw, etc. Or you can have them all presented on one single screen as quirks and have them either have a positive or negative cost in terms of build points, or however you want to do it. I am leaning towards the quirk approach these days, so I'm going with quirks. Now this one here, the descriptions for people use a custom markup language, which brings in all of their characteristics like hair color, eye color, etc. And as they change, for example, if they had eye color in their short description and then their eye got severed, it might change it to one-eyed instead of blue-eyed. Or if they dyed their hair a different color, it would change their descriptions, etc. The markup's a little bit complex. I ship with a whole bunch of starting descriptions, and people can always add their own. This either enables or disables that choice at character creation. I personally prefer to disable it because I find that people get confused a little bit by the markup and either create descriptions that don't work well with the engine, or it just becomes they feel like they have to write a custom description because it's giving them the option. It's up to you. I choose no, so I don't like that option. If people really want a custom description, we can set it up for them later. So there we go. The culture seeder. So this sets up things like cultures, names. It can set up ethnicities. It's important for you to run this culture seeder even if you don't import any of the culture packs, but you can do those too. So here's the culture packs. You can choose none if you're not doing them. I'll eventually add some fictional settings as well, like maybe I'll make a Middle Earth one where it imports like all the different types of humans and elves and all the languages and naming conventions and all that sort of stuff. But for the moment, I have an Earth Modern, which is basically just an export of LabMUD's setup, or Earth Antiquity, which is one that I wrote up, which is, as it sounds, a sort of European antiquity, um, European antiquity setup. We do want to install the name cultures and random name generators. We do want to install the languages, accents, and scripts, and we do want to install the races and ethnicities, although I haven't actually got those in for the culture seeder yet, for the Roman one that is there for the Earth one. And then the useful seeder, this one's totally optional, but I do still recommend that you run it. It's got a few things that are not yet implemented, like AIs, as you can see, terrain types, very important. These are useful. I haven't yet got around to the modern stuff, but we wouldn't want to do it. Doors. You have to enter a skill for installing doors, something like a construction skill. It'll create it here. There we go. That's all of the stuff done. So once we've run through the full seeder now, everything that's there, we can now quit the seeder. What we need to do now is we need to get the engine. So now that we've run the seeder, there's a couple of files that it's created. You'll notice it's created a startmud shell script, and it's also created a file called connection.config. You want to edit connection.config. This basically tells it what port, so 4000 was what we're going to leave it, and you should update this IP address to the public IP address of your server as well. And the startmud script is basically a little bash script. All it does is runs the mud with your see when you run it. Actually generated it wrong there. When you run it, you need to supply a few command line arguments, basically your database details, which it has. And it's basically if you reboot it or it crashes or whatever, it just keeps rebooting it up. So by the time you see this video, I might have improved the seeder to not give you the wrong information there. Whoops. I obviously did not copy the right thing there. Alright, wget. So now we're downloading the engine file. We're unzipping it. You can just replace everything. We'll chmod again. And then, all things being well and good, start mud. Did I get that wrong? I'm showing my Linux unfamiliarity here. You know what, being as this is just a demo, I might just show you the way to do it manually. So as we saw before, just going to copy those command line arguments. Mud sharp. And there we go. Booting the server. Again, with Linux, I probably should have put an ampersand at the end of that line to make it run as a background script. Did that crash? I know what I've done. I've not uploaded the most recent version of the server yet. I'll have to do a FutureMUD release later today. There's a very small change that changed something in the database, so that one on the website's out of date. So once again, that won't happen for you. It'll load through, but that's it. We've run through the setup, so you should now be able to connect to the MUD. You'll have to connect with your IP address or whatever you've set up. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this guide. I'll be subsequently releasing some videos on, what next, and a bit of a 101 about how to use the engine and set things up. But this should at least walk you through the installation and setup procedure. So I hope it's been informative, and thank you very much.